November 20, 1943. 0541 hours. Bidyo Island, Tarawa Atoll. The binoculars shook slightly as Rear Admiral Kei Shibazaki lowered them from his eyes, observing the pre-dawn darkness erupt with naval gunfire that would soon prove completely insufficient against his fortress. It would take 1 million men 100 years to seize Tarawa. Through the observation slit of his reinforced concrete command bunker, buried under 10 feet of coral sand and coconut logs, Shibazaki scanned defenses that represented the ultimate pinnacle of Japanese military engineering. 4,500 Imperial Marines, the Special Naval Landing Forces, Japan's elite, held positions that had taken 15 months to construct, every angle calculated, every field of fire interlocking, every inch of beach pre-registered for artillery. The Americans approaching his fortress had no idea they were entering the most concentrated killing ground ever assembled on a landmass measuring just 291 acres, smaller than Central Park. In precisely 76 hours, 18,000 United States Marines would prove him catastrophically wrong, though at a cost that would shock America and forever alter amphibious warfare. The battle would produce casualties beyond comprehension, over 3,000 American casualties, including 1,090 Marines killed and 2,100 wounded. Of the 4,500 Japanese defenders, only 17 would survive as prisoners, along with 129 Korean laborers. Neither Shibazaki nor the approaching Marines knew they were about to engage in the most concentrated violence in modern warfare history, a battle that would see more casualties per square yard than any engagement before or since. Bidyo Island measured less than half a square mile, 3,800 yards long by 600 yards wide at its widest point, with a maximum elevation of just 10 feet above sea level. Into this confined space, the Japanese had concentrated defensive power that would have impressed the architects of the Maginot Line. Since September 1942, Korean laborers and Japanese engineers had transformed this coral atoll into something unprecedented in military history, an entire island converted into a single fortress. The statistics were staggering. Over 100 major pillboxes and bunkers, 14 coastal defense guns, including 4 massive 8-inch Vickers naval rifles purchased from Britain in 1905, 40 field artillery pieces, over 200 machine gun positions, each protecting the others in interlocking patterns that left no dead space on any beach. The construction itself represented a masterpiece of military engineering. Each major bunker consisted of reinforced concrete walls up to 5 feet thick, made from a special mix including crushed coral, which actually made it stronger than conventional concrete. Over this, layers of coconut logs, palmwood so dense it would not float, formed additional barriers. These logs, some 18 in diameter, could absorb tremendous explosive force. Railroad rails shipped from Japan at enormous expense created frameworks capable of withstanding direct hits from naval guns. The entire complex was then covered with sand and coral in places 10 to 12 feet deep, which absorbed explosive impacts better than any modern material. The Japanese had also deployed unique hexagonal steel pillboxes, some dating back to the Russo-Japanese War, providing additional defensive positions. These steel structures, combined with the concrete emplacements, created a defensive network of extraordinary resilience. November 19, 1943. USS Maryland, 125 miles southwest of Tarawa. Major Michael P. Ryan stood on deck, observing the armada surrounding him, the largest amphibious assault force America had assembled in the Pacific War to date: 17 aircraft carriers, 12 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 66 destroyers, 36 transport ships carrying the 2nd Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal who believed they had already seen the worst the Japanese could offer. They were wrong. The intelligence briefing had been confident. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner had assured the Marines that the preliminary bombardment would be so thorough they could practically walk ashore unopposed. The naval bombardment plan called for the delivery of thousands of shells in 3 hours, more explosive force concentrated on a single target than in any previous Pacific operation. Yet some Marines harbored doubts. Colonel David Shoup, who would lead the assault, had studied every aerial photograph until his eyes burned. The island's defenses were not just strong, they were geometrically perfect, designed by someone who understood defensive warfare with precise calculation. More troubling were the tides. The attack required a 5-foot tide to carry the landing craft over the coral reef surrounding Bidyo. The Navy promised it would be sufficient. Major Frank Holland, a New Zealand officer who had lived in the Gilbert Islands for 15 years, had warned them about the dodging tide, a rare phenomenon that could leave the reef exposed unpredictably. His warnings had been noted but largely dismissed by Navy tide experts, who insisted their calculations were correct. November 20, 1943. 0505 hours. The bombardment began with the battleship Maryland firing the first salvo from her 16-inch guns. Within minutes, the pre-dawn darkness transformed into artificial daylight as hundreds of naval guns opened fire simultaneously. From the transport ships 10 miles offshore, Marines watched in awe as BDO vanished under a cloud of smoke and fire rising thousands of feet. For 3 hours, the destruction continued. Battleships Colorado and Maryland fired hundreds of 16-inch shells. The Tennessee added 14-inch shells in rapid succession. Light cruisers contributed 6-inch shells by the thousands. Destroyers fired until their barrels glowed red with heat. In total, over 3,000 shells struck the tiny island. At 0542, carrier aircraft joined the assault. Dive bombers and torpedo planes dropped ordnance in patterns designed to systematically destroy every marked position. The smoke column rose high enough to be seen from 30 miles away. But something was wrong. Through the haze, naval spotters began reporting disturbing observations. The 8-inch coastal guns were still firing, anti-aircraft positions remained active. As the smoke cleared slightly, the bunkers and pillboxes stood intact like ancient monuments, impervious to modern firepower. The after-action report later revealed the terrible truth of the 100-plus major defensive positions on BDO. The 3-hour bombardment had destroyed exactly 4. Thousands of shells across 291 acres had delivered minimal concentrated firepower against individual hardened positions, each no larger than a small house. The coral sand absorbed much of the explosive force, while the coconut log reinforcements proved remarkably resilient except against direct hits. November 20, 1943. 0630 hours. Major Holland's warnings about the dodging tide proved tragically accurate. The Navy's tide experts had calculated 5 feet of water over the reef, but Holland had insisted it would be insufficient for the Higgins boats, which required 4 feet of clearance when fully loaded. In reality, the tide provided only 3 feet of water, not the 18 and some later accounts claimed, but still disastrously inadequate. As the first wave of Higgins boats approached the reef at 0700 hours, they discovered the ocean's betrayal. The boats ground to a halt on the coral 500 to 800 yards from shore. Marines would have to wade through chested water across the lagoon under direct fire from positions the bombardment had barely touched. Only the first 3 waves had amphibious tractors, LVTs, or alligators that could crawl over the reef. There were only 125 of these vehicles available, barely enough for 1,500 men. The remaining Marines of the initial assault waves would have to abandon their stranded Higgins boats and wade through the murderous lagoon. November 20, 1943, 0755 hours. As the first LVTS crossed the reef and entered the lagoon, Shibazaki's defensive system revealed its deadly efficiency. Every vehicle had to pass through pre-registered kill zones where artillery, mortars, and machine guns could concentrate their fire with devastating accuracy. The Japanese had spent months calculating exact ranges and angles for maximum lethality. The LVTS that survived to reach the beach encountered another trap. The seawall, a coconut log barrier 3 to 5 feet high, provided the only cover on the beach. But the Japanese had positioned their bunkers to fire parallel along the wall, not perpendicular to it. Marines huddling against the logs for protection were actually exposed to enfilading fire from multiple positions. This seemingly counterintuitive placement demonstrated the sophistication of Japanese defensive planning. The numbers from the first hour stunned military observers. Of 125 LVTS in the initial waves, 90 were destroyed or disabled. The carefully designed fields of fire were working exactly as intended, with each defensive position supporting the others in a lethal web of crossfire. November 20, 1943. 0830 hours. The 4th, 5th, and 6th waves discovered the true horror of amphibious assault against prepared defenses. With their Higgins boats grounded on the reef, 3,500 Marines began the 700-Y wade through the lagoon. The water depth varied from waist deep to neck deep depending on the coral formations below. Men carrying 60 pounds of equipment struggled to move faster than a slow walk. The Japanese had anticipated this scenario. They had registered their mortars on the reef edge where boats would ground. Machine guns were positioned to sweep the lagoon with interlocking arcs of fire. The clear tropical water offered no concealment. At an average wading speed, each Marine would be under aimed fire for 35 minutes, an eternity in combat. The casualties mounted with terrible efficiency. Entire squads were eliminated before reaching the beach. Men hit once would go under, struggle back up, only to be hit again. The weight of their equipment meant that wounded Marines who lost consciousness would drown in 3 feet of water. Blood in the water attracted sharks, adding another dimension of horror to an already nightmarish scenario. November 20th, 1943. 0915 hours. Those who survived the wade found themselves in a new crisis. The seawall that provided the only cover could shelter perhaps 500 men along its accessible length. By 9:30, over 1,500 Marines were trying to occupy that space, with more arriving every minute. Those who couldn't fit had to lie exposed on the open beach or in the shallow water. The Japanese positions now revealed their brilliant positioning. A single bunker could fire along hundreds of yards of seawall. Machine guns at different heights could fire over Marines in front to hit those behind. Mortars had been pre-registered on the seawall positions, meaning Japanese gunners could drop rounds with deadly accuracy without even seeing their targets. The geometric precision of the defense created a killing field where survival became a matter of pure chance rather than tactical skill. Marines pressed against the sea wall had perhaps 18 in of protection. Any movement meant exposure to dozens of Japanese weapons. November 20th, 1943, 10:30 hours. Colonel David Shoup waded ashore after his landing craft was destroyed 500 yards from the beach. Hit in the leg by shrapnel during the wade but still mobile, he established his command post against the seawall and began assessing the catastrophic situation. Of the 3,500 Marines who had attempted to land in the first 2 hours, approximately 1,500 were casualties. The survivors held a beachhead roughly 700 yards long and at its deepest penetration, perhaps 20 yards inland. But Shoup identified a critical vulnerability in the Japanese defenses. While the positions were mutually supporting, the destruction of even one bunker would create a gap in the interlocking fields of fire. These gaps could be exploited to attack other positions from angles the Japanese hadn't fortified. The perfect defensive geometry contained the seeds of its own destruction. It required every position to remain functional. Over a failing radio, Shoup issued the orders that would define the battle. Continue the attack regardless of casualties. There would be no withdrawal, no pause for reorganization. The only path to victory lay in maintaining relentless pressure until the defensive system cracked. November 20th, 1943, 1,100 hours. The battle's turning point came not from coordinated assault, but from individual Marines making independent decisions to attack specific positions regardless of the odds. These actions, though seemingly suicidal, began to unravel the Japanese defensive network. First, Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins led his scout sniper platoon in a series of attacks on Japanese positions. Military doctrine dictated that approaching fortified positions across open ground meant almost certain death. Hawkins ignored doctrine. With a handful of volunteers, he systematically attacked multiple machine gun positions, using grenades, demolition charges, and rifle fire. Though mortally wounded on November 21, Hawkins had personally eliminated or neutralized 6 enemy positions, creating crucial gaps in the Japanese defenses. Staff Sergeant William J. Bourdillon, already wounded multiple times, assaulted 2 machine gun positions with demolition charges on November 20. He destroyed both positions before being killed while attacking a third. His actions eliminated a critical strong point that had been devastating Marines along the seawall. First, Lieutenant Alexander Bondman Jr., a combat engineer who had left a successful business to enlist, led the assault on the largest Japanese position, a massive bomb-proof shelter that served as a command post. On November 22, Boney Amon led Marines up the sand slope covering the bunker, while under intense fire. Reaching the top, he stood fully exposed, firing down into the bunker's entrances while his men brought up demolition charges. He held this position until killed by machine gun fire, but his sacrifice allowed the Marines to destroy this critical position. November 20, 1943, 1,400 hours. Inside the remaining Japanese bunkers, a terrible realization was spreading. The Americans weren't responding to casualties the way military doctrine predicted. Units that had suffered 50% casualties, the point at which most forces lose combat effectiveness, were still advancing. The Marines were absorbing losses that should have caused complete collapse. Yet, they continued attacking. The Japanese had based their defense on the assumption that any rational military force would cease attacking after suffering 30% casualties. The mathematical certainty of this had been built into their defensive planning. But the Marines were proving that human determination could overcome tactical logic. The Japanese defenders, for all their preparation, had no response to this variable. Their perfect geometric defense required defenders to remain at their positions, maintaining the interlocking fields of fire. But as Marines eliminated positions one by one, gaps appeared in the defensive network. Each gap allowed more Marines to advance, which created more gaps, accelerating the systematic collapse of the defensive system. November 20, 1943, 1,600 hours. By late afternoon, the rising tide finally allowed some landing craft to reach the beach directly, though many still grounded on the reef. Reinforcements began arriving in greater numbers, though they still faced intense fire. The beach, which had been a pure killing ground 6 hours earlier, was now a chaotic but functional landing zone as Marines consolidated their positions and pushed inland meter by bloody meter. Colonel Shoup, still commanding from his position near the seawall despite his wounds, coordinated the battle through runners, Marines who volunteered to carry messages across fire-swept ground. The mortality rate for these runners was appalling, but volunteers never ceased coming forward. Their courage in maintaining communications proved vital to coordinating the assault when most radio equipment had been destroyed by saltwater or enemy fire. The individual acts of courage were creating cumulative effects. Where Japanese planners had calculated fields of fire and casualty ratios, the Marines were demonstrating that determination could overcome defensive advantages. Progress was measured in yards gained at terrible cost, but it was progress nonetheless. November 20, 1943, 2,100 hours. As darkness fell on the first day, the Americans held a precarious beachhead of approximately 5,000 Marines who had attempted to land. Over 1,500 were casualties. But they were ashore and had proven that Shibazaki's fortress could be cracked. The night brought new challenges. The Japanese trained in night fighting prepared for potential counterattacks. However, instead of the traditional massive banzai charge, they conducted smaller probing attacks trying to infiltrate marine lines. The Marines, expecting a major assault, remained on high alert throughout the night. Colonel Shoup ordered his exhausted men to improve their positions and prepare for the next day's fighting. Small groups continued to probe Japanese defenses, identifying weak points for tomorrow's assaults. The Marines discovered that their enemies, while formidable in prepared positions, were less effective in fluid night combat where the advantages of fortification were minimized. November 21, 1943. 0600 hours. Dawn revealed both the carnage of the first day and the changing tactical situation. Marine reinforcements had landed during the night, bringing total strength on the island to approximately 7,000 men. The Japanese, unable to reinforce or resupply, had lost an estimated 1,000 defenders. Major Michael P. Ryan led a crucial assault on Green Beach on BDO's western shore. This beach was less heavily defended than the northern beaches where the main assault had occurred. Ryan's forces landed with relatively lighter casualties and immediately began pushing east along the island's axis, attacking Japanese positions from directions they hadn't anticipated or fortified against. The systematic reduction of Japanese strong points accelerated. Marines had learned costly lessons about bunker assault. Each position required specific solutions. Either direct fire from the Sherman tanks that had finally made it ashore, or combat engineers with demolition charges and flamethrowers. The process was methodical and brutal. Suppress with covering fire, advance with demolitions, destroy, and move to the next position. November 21, 1943. 1,400 hours. The assault on Admiral Shibazaki's command bunker, the largest defensive structure on the island, became the battle's symbolic turning point. The massive structure, built with concrete walls 5 feet thick and covered by tons of sand and coral, had multiple fighting positions and underground chambers that could hold 300 men. The assault required coordination between tanks, engineers, and infantry. Sherman tanks fired point blank into the bunker's apertures while Marines provided covering fire. Engineers rushed forward with satchel charges, throwing them into any opening. When these proved insufficient to breach the main structure, Marines used bulldozers to push sand and coral against the bunker's entrances, sealing the defenders inside. The final solution was grimly effective. Hundreds of gallons of gasoline were poured into the bunker's ventilation system and ignited. The resulting explosion and fire killed an estimated 300 Japanese defenders. Admiral Shibazaki himself likely died in this bunker, though his body was never definitively identified among the burned remains. November 21, 1943, 1,630 hours. The capture of BDO's airfield. The strategic reason for the entire operation occurred on the second day. The airfield, though damaged by bombardment, was within Marine lines and would soon be repaired for American use. The Japanese had concentrated their defenses to protect this vital installation. But their assumption that Americans would prioritize the airfield above all else proved incorrect. The Marines had been willing to take massive casualties to establish any foothold, then expand systematically regardless of specific objectives. This willingness to accept casualties for incremental gains had broken the Japanese defensive concept. They had prepared for an enemy that would concentrate on specific objectives, not one that would simply grind forward regardless of cost until the entire island was taken. November 22, 1943. 0600 hours. By the third day's dawn, Marines controlled approximately 2/3 of BDO. Japanese resistance had fragmented into isolated pockets, fighting without coordination. Of the original 4,500 defenders, fewer than 1,000 remained alive, many wounded and all running low on ammunition. These final defenders, knowing their situation was hopeless, fought with the fury of men who had accepted death. Each pillbox had to be completely destroyed. Any position left partially suppressed would resume firing once Marines had passed. The solution was systematic annihilation. Flamethrowers to clear the interior, demolition charges to collapse the structure, then more flamethrower work to ensure no survivors remained. November 22, 1943. 1,000 hours. The last major Japanese resistance centered on a complex of interconnected bunkers on BDO's eastern tail, designated the Pocket by Marine Intelligence. Approximately 500 Japanese defenders had created a final redoubt using the narrow tail of the island to concentrate their remaining firepower. The reduction of the pocket required 14 hours of continuous combat. Each bunker was subjected to the same methodical process. Tank fire to suppress, engineers with charges to breach, flamethrowers to clear, and infantry to confirm elimination. Marines advanced approximately 20 yards. Our seemingly glacial progress, but actually faster than the first day's bloody crawl across the beaches. By nightfall on November 22, the pocket had been reduced. The few surviving Japanese conducted a final banzai charge after midnight, a futile gesture that ended in their complete annihilation under Marine machine gun fire. November 23, 1943. 1,330 hours. At 1,330 hours on November 23, after 76 hours of continuous combat, BTO was declared secure. The final toll was staggering. Of 4,500 Japanese defenders, only 17 Japanese soldiers survived as prisoners. Additional 129 Korean laborers who had been forced to work on the fortifications also survived. The Japanese had achieved a 99.7% casualty rate, virtually complete annihilation. American casualties totaled 109 Marines and 30 sailors. Killed with 1,000 and 1 wounded. In 76 hours, the 2nd Marine Division had suffered more casualties than the Marine Corps experienced in 6 months of fighting on Guadalcanal. The casualty rate exceeded 17%, the highest of any American division in any Pacific battle to that point. But the strategic victory was complete. The airfield was operational within days, supporting operations throughout the Central Pacific. More importantly, the lessons learned, written in blood on Tarawa's coral sand, would save thousands of lives in subsequent operations. The aftermath of Tarawa triggered the most comprehensive revision of amphibious warfare doctrine in American military history. Every aspect of the battle was analyzed, every failure documented, every success studied. The Navy acknowledged that its pre-invasion bombardment had been wholly inadequate. Future operations would feature prolonged bombardments lasting days or weeks rather than hours, using armor-piercing shells with delayed fuses, specifically designed to penetrate reinforced concrete. The establishment of underwater demolition teams, precursors to the Navy SEALs, would ensure accurate reconnaissance of beach conditions and removal of obstacles. The value of amphibious tractors was definitively proven. Production increased dramatically with improved models featuring armor protection and better reef crossing capability. The LVT-2 Water Buffalo and the amphibious truck DUKW would become standard equipment, eliminating the deadly wade-through lagoons that had cost so many lives at Tarawa. Communication equipment was redesigned for waterproofing with redundant systems to ensure coordination even when primary radios failed. New bunker-busting shells were developed specifically to defeat Japanese-style fortifications. Within 6 months of Tarawa, napalm would be introduced to the Pacific theater, providing a weapon specifically designed to clear fortified positions. Each innovation traced directly back to specific failures at Tarawa, purchased with Marine blood in Tokyo. The loss of Tarawa sent shock waves through Imperial General Headquarters. The Americans had done something Japanese military doctrine deemed impossible. They had accepted catastrophic casualties to take a strategically limited objective. The willingness to sustain such losses for a tiny island demonstrated American determination that Japanese planners had fatally underestimated. The Japanese had calculated that island fortresses would exhaust American resolve through attrition. Tarawa proved the opposite. Americans would accept any casualties necessary to maintain strategic momentum. The entire Japanese defensive strategy required reconsideration. If Americans would pay such a price for Tarawa, no position in the Pacific could stop them. Japanese defenders on other islands studied every report from Tarawa, but the lessons were dispiriting. The Americans had learned from their mistakes and would not repeat them. Future island assaults would feature overwhelming firepower, better equipment, and refined tactics. All lessons learned from the disaster and triumph of Tarawa. Decades after the battle, Tarawa veterans struggled to convey the intensity of those 76 hours. The concentration of violence in such a small space and compressed time frame defied normal combat experience. Marines who had fought across the Pacific universally rated Tarawa as their worst experience. Worse than Ioma, worse than Okinawa, worse than Pelu. The battle's survivors formed a unique fraternity bound by shared experience of the most concentrated killing ground in Marine Corps history. At reunions, they spoke of things that couldn't be adequately conveyed to those who hadn't been there. The wade through the lagoon. Under fire, the desperate fight at the sea wall, the systematic reduction of positions that seemed impregnable. Many veterans returned to Tarawa in later years, finding it hard to reconcile the peaceful tropical island with the hell they remembered. The bunkers remained, slowly being reclaimed by jungle, rusted hulks of LVTS, still visible in the lagoon at low tide. These physical remnants served as monuments to the price paid for victory. The Marine Corps' official after-action report on Tarawa was subtitled Lessons Written in Blood, acknowledging that every tactical improvement recommended had been paid for with Marine casualties. The report identified 38 major lessons, each linked to specific failures that had cost lives. Among the critical lessons, area naval bombardment could not destroy point targets. Future operations would require direct fire at specific positions for extended periods. Aerial photography alone was insufficient for intelligence. Human reconnaissance, including swimmer scouts, was essential. Tide calculations must account for worst-case scenarios with contingency planning for unexpected conditions. Communication equipment had to be completely waterproofed with multiple redundant systems. Tank infantry coordination was not optional, but essential for bunker reduction. Major General Julian Smith commanding the 2nd Marine Division added a personal observation that captured the essence of Tarawa. Every mistake made had been paid for in blood. But those sacrifices had purchased knowledge that would save countless lives in future operations. Within weeks of Tarawa's capture, its strategic value was proven. B-24 Liberator bombers operating from the rebuilt airfield struck Japanese positions throughout the Marshall Islands, softening them for the next American advance. Photo reconnaissance missions from Tarawa provided intelligence that proved invaluable for planning subsequent operations. But Tarawa's greatest value was psychological. It had proven to the Japanese that no position, regardless of fortification, could stop the American advance if the United States was willing to pay the price. This knowledge undermined Japanese morale, even as it strengthened American resolve. The Willingness to accept such casualties for victory demonstrated a determination that transcended tactical considerations. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, later assessed that Tarawa was the turning point, not because of territory gained, but because of what it proved about American resolve and adaptability. The road to Tokyo was open if America had the will to travel it, regardless of the cost. 3 months after Tarawa, Marines assaulted the Marshall Islands, using every lesson learned from the earlier battle. The contrast was dramatic. Guadalcanal, more heavily defended than Tarawa, fell with 1/5 if the casualties. The island of Inweto, equally fortified, was taken with minimal losses compared to Tarawa's bloodbath. The key differences were systematic. Prolonged naval bombardment with armor-piercing shells actually destroyed Japanese positions. Abundant amphibious tractors eliminated the deadly reef crossing. Underwater demolition teams had cleared obstacles and provided accurate beach intelligence. Improved tank infantry coordination allowed rapid bunker reduction. Flamethrowers were available from the first wave. Every improvement traced directly back to failures at Tarawa. The blood spilled on that tiny island had purchased tactical knowledge that transformed American amphibious capabilities. Future operations would still be costly, but never again would Marines face the perfect storm of failures that had made Tarawa such a killing ground. Beyond the statistics lay individual tragedies that defined Tarawa's true cost. Of the 4 Medal of Honor recipients, 3 died, earning their decorations. Hawkins, Banyan, and Borderin gave their lives attacking positions that seemed impregnable. Only Colonel Shoup survived to wear his medal, later becoming the 22nd Commandant of the Marine Corps. Thousands of Marines were wounded in ways that would affect them for life, physically and psychologically. The intensity of combat in such a compressed time and space left mental scars that wouldn't be fully understood. 4 decades. Post-traumatic stress disorder, not yet recognized or named, affected countless Tarawa veterans who struggled to process their experiences. The Japanese defenders had fought with equal courage, dying almost to a man for their emperor and homeland. Their defensive preparations had been brilliant, their resistance fanatical, their sacrifice complete. Only 17 Japanese soldiers and 1 officer survived from the entire garrison. A testament to their determination to fight to the death rather than surrender. The Korean laborers who survived represented another dimension of the tragedy. Forced to build the fortifications, then forced to fight in the final battle, they were victims of a war not of their making. Their survival rate was actually higher than the Japanese defenders, as some were able to surrender once it became clear the Japanese could no longer prevent them. Tarawa's influence extended far beyond World War II. The battle became required study at military academies worldwide. Examined not for tactical brilliance, there was little, but for what it revealed about resolve and overcoming preparation. The Japanese had constructed the ideal defensive position. The Americans had seized it nonetheless through sheer determination and willingness to endure casualties. Modern military doctrine still draws lessons from Tarawa: the importance of precise intelligence, the necessity of specialized equipment for specific combat environments, the critical value of joint operations across services, and above all, the recognition that human will can overcome tactical disadvantages. All of these lessons trace back to those 76 hours on BDO. The creation of special operations units, the emphasis on reconnaissance, the development of precision munitions to reduce fortifications, and the doctrine of overwhelming force at the point of attack all have roots in the bloody lessons of Tarawa. The battle demonstrated that no position is impregnable if the attacker is willing to pay the cost. Admiral Shibazaki's boast that it would take 1 million men 100 years to conquer Tarawa became one of history's most spectacularly incorrect military predictions. In just 76 hours, 18,000 Marines showed that determination could overcome any fortress, that American democracy could produce warriors as committed as any totalitarian system, and that no defensive position, however perfect, could resist the assault of free men fighting for a just cause. The arithmetic was harsh but straightforward: 3,000 American casualties to eliminate 4,500 Japanese defenders and seize a single small island. By any tactical standard, the casualty ratio was unacceptable. But wars are not won by tactical calculations alone, they are won by nations willing to bear the cost of victory. Tarawa proved Americans would pay that cost. The Japanese had assumed that American democracy, with its respect for human life, could not sustain such losses. They discovered that Americans, when convinced of the righteousness of their cause, would accept whatever sacrifices were necessary for victory. Tarawa remains one of the most significant battles in American military history, not for what was gained, a single airfield, but for what was learned. The battle reshaped American amphibious warfare doctrine, proved American resolve to both allies and enemies, and demonstrated that no position in the Pacific was impregnable if the United States was willing to pay the price of victory. The courage displayed by Marines at Tarawa became legendary: men who waded through hundreds of yards of fire-swept water, attacked fortified positions with minimal cover, and advanced when survival seemed impossible. They proved that American fighting spirit could rival anyone's. Their sacrifice earned not only victory at Tarawa but knowledge that would save thousands of lives in future engagements. Colonel David Shoup, reflecting on the battle years later, offered perhaps the most concise summary. Shibazaki had said 1,000,000 Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years. He was wrong. It took 18,000 Marines 76 hours. The difference between his calculation and reality was that he measured in concrete and steel. The Americans measured in determination. The ultimate lesson of Tarawa transcends military history. It shows that human will can overcome seemingly impossible odds, that freedom-loving people will make extraordinary sacrifices when required, and that no tyranny, however well fortified, can withstand determined free people. In 76 hours, the Marines had not merely captured an island, they had demonstrated that the path to Tokyo was open, that American resolve was unbreakable, and that victory, however costly, was inevitable. Admiral Shibazaki had been wrong about everything except one fact: the price would be terrible. But the Americans were willing to pay it. The Marines who waded through the lagoon, huddled against seawalls, and charged those impregnable positions had transformed the impossible into the inevitable. In doing so, they wrote one of the most heroic chapters in American military history, paid for in blood on the coral sands of a tiny Pacific island called Tarawa.